Thank you, Michelle. It was some years ago. I know I had not met Caroline. I don't even remember if I was pastoring at that point, but it was on a Sunday, and it was after church, and I was at my parents' house having lunch. My parents were there, my sister was there, and my grandmother was there. We'd sat down to eat. I don't remember anything else that my mom had made except for the fact that she had made some potato salad. I don't pretend to be some great cook. However, I do know that potato salad is kind of a pain to make. I mean, for one thing, you've got to peel all those potatoes. You've got to boil them, but you don't boil them too long, because if you boil them too long, you wind up with mashed potatoes, which is not potato salad. Anyway, so you've peeled them, you've cut them, you've boiled them, and then you mix together mayonnaise and mustard, and if you really know the Lord, you put some sweet relish in there, and because that's how potato salad should be made. And anyway, I'm not a huge potato salad fan, but I like it. I'm not like racing to get to it or anything, but I'm fine with it. Anyway, so whatever else my mom had that day, she also had some potato salad that she had made. And again, that's not something, you don't accidentally wind up with potato salad. You've gone to some length to prepare this, and so she has done that. We've said the blessing. It's now time to eat. Everybody's got some of the stuff on their plates. In my case, including also some potato salad. I get my fork, I put some in my mouth, and immediately I hear music. It's not the sound of angels. It's more like a dun, dun, dun. Something's wrong. Something's deeply, deeply wrong. And I don't know if I weighed the pros and cons of saying something. Nevertheless, I blurted out this question: what's wrong with the potato salad? At that point, and I don't remember which person it was, somebody else at the table said, "I'm glad you said that. I was wondering the same thing too." At that point, my mom said, "Oh, I guess it does make a difference." And what had happened is that she had bought this detestable product that's called fat-free mayonnaise. I don't know if you know the story of that, but Satan and his demons, in a cauldron heated by the flames of hell, decided, we will make this demonic substance called fat-free mayonnaise, and we will perpetrate the hoax upon people that it is good. It is not. It is not. And so I guess at that point my mom tasted it and realized as well, it too was nasty. And regardless of all the work that she had put into it, the time, effort, energy, and even money in this, it all got dumped in the trash can. And thankfully, fat-free mayonnaise has never touched our fat lips anymore. I say all that to say this. I had asked the question, and somebody else said this. I'm kind of glad you said that. I was wondering the same thing myself. You have experienced that type of thing probably a varied number of times in your life this far. Maybe it was as a student in school. Maybe it was as an employee at work. Maybe it was in some neighborhood meeting. But anyway, something was going on, and there was something that prompted a question in your mind. But either you didn't get the opportunity to ask, or perhaps you were fearful of asking, thinking, hey, I don't want to be the one that looks dumb. I don't want to be the person that asks that question. But whatever reason, you don't ask it, but somebody else does. And in your mind, even if you don't express this to them, you say, man, I'm grateful for you because I was wondering the same thing. Now, if you are here today as a follower of Christ, there are some circumstances that you have experienced in life already thus far that have generated some questions, to be sure. Some questions that you would like to say, God, what's up with this? God, why are you doing this? Or God, why are you not doing that? There are already stacks of circumstances where you have encountered experiences in life that have generated questions that you would like answers to from the Lord. The good news is this. When Jesus walked among us, he was encountering and was encountered by a lot of people. People who, among other things, asked him a varied number of questions. Questions that are recorded for us in the pages of Scripture. And not only do we get their questions, we get the way in which Jesus responded. And candidly, if you pay attention to the questions that were asked by Jesus, asked of Jesus, if you think about it, oftentimes these are some of the very same questions that we have pondered and wondered about ourselves. And so that's what we're doing today, beginning a new series that I've called I Was Wondering, Questions and Answers with Jesus. And we're going to be looking at questions that people come to Jesus with and they say, well, Jesus, I want to know X. Because in all likelihood, what they have wondered about, or they wondered about, you too either have or you will experience the same question. So we're going to see today our first question today in Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, if you would look with me in your Bibles there today. In case you were wondering, reduced fat mayonnaise is okay. Fat-free crosses the line. Mark chapter 8. The plan is pretty simple. We're going to read this, think about its context, and then say, what does this have to do with me? That's our plan. Mark chapter 8, verse 1. In those days there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. He called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered him, and here's the question. Where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? Jesus asked, how many loaves do you have? 7, they said. Verse 6, he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served them to the crowd. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. They ate and were satisfied. Then they collected 7 large baskets of leftover pieces. About 4,000 were there. Jesus dismissed them, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. All right, context. What's going on here? Jesus has been going about doing the work of ministry, and he's been encountering people of progressively larger numbers over time. Because when Jesus is encountering people, he's doing a number of things. For one thing, he is teaching with authority that gets people's attention. He's communicating spiritual truth that they have not been exposed to before. And so that garners people's attention. But what really is an attention getter is the fact that they have observed, many of them, they have had a front row seat to Jesus doing that which can only be described as miraculous. And so word is beginning to spread, and so that at the very least generates stacks more of, if nothing else, curiosity seekers who are wondering for themselves, might this be true of Jesus, what I have heard? And so as he's going about from place to place, the crowds get larger and larger and larger. Here we have Jesus experiencing this circumstance with a crowd that Mark describes numbers in excess of 4,000. Now consistently, and you're probably familiar or been exposed to this reality as well, that oftentimes when the New Testament would give a number, oftentimes that number included only men. And so it's possible that it did or did not. We can't say for sure. We know that there's at least 4,000, but it could have been multiple times more if women and children were not included in that original figure. That being said, you might also say, wait a minute, I thought Jesus fed the 5,000. Well, he did. He did. That was 2 chapters earlier. This is a completely different miracle. We have recorded for us the feeding of the 5,000. Here we have recorded for us the feeding of the 4,000. Anyway, so we have Mark introducing us to the reality that there is this group of people who is gathered around Jesus. Where they are, we don't know. We know that he leaves there and heads to this other region that is described in verse 10. We don't know exactly where they are, but the context bears out the reality and the fact that it is a desolate, that's how the disciples described it, as a desolate place. They are not in town. They are not surrounded by people and things and stuff. The other thing is, you can imagine probably that a hill of some sort is involved, because they have been with Jesus and he's been teaching them, not for one afternoon, not for a day, not for 2 days, but for 3 days now he's been teaching them. So you've got to think, for them to be able to hear, in the absence of amplification, there's probably a hillside, a mountainside of some sort, where Jesus can address them and people in mass numbers might be able to hear. So they're out away from all this stuff. Jesus has been teaching them. And so, again, he has been doing this not for an hour or two, but this is now stretched into the third day. Can you imagine that? 3 days. But could you imagine the glory of listening to me for 3 days? What I would describe as the glory of listening to me for 3 days. Anyway, you would not think that to be the case. Anyway, 3 days have passed. And after this teaching has occurred, Jesus, it seems, is done, and he's ready to dismiss the crowds, but notes the fact they've been with me for 3 days and haven't had anything to eat. Now, that doesn't mean that no one had any little thing with them, but like they haven't stopped, per se, for big meals. People haven't brought stuff. It seems in all likelihood that this kind of was this wasn't like a planned crusade. These people show up, Jesus starts teaching, it stretches from 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. They hadn't planned to do this. They just came to experience Jesus, and it just keeps on going. And so it has now been going for 3 days, and Jesus notes that the people are hungry, and he can't just dismiss them because physically they might not be able, some of them, to make the journey because of the distance, and in the absence of any nutrition, they're probably just going to pass out. But think about that. They have been listening to Jesus for all this time, and they haven't had anything of consequence to eat. I mean, some of you, it's all you can do to listen to me for a half hour before your stomach is... Sounds like the cake on the Little Rascals episode, if you remember that. That's what your stomach may be sounding like. But they've been listening to Jesus for 3 days. And so Jesus has just announced and articulated the problem. And so the disciples respond with the question in verse 4, and you see it. Where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? And so you say, well, Michael, thank you for that. I can clearly see that is a question. The whole question mark, the punctuation at the end of the sentence identifies that there's a question. But in the scheme of things, what does that have to do with me? Because, my family may be large, but at the biggest time of the year in terms of a meal at Thanksgiving, I'm not feeding 4,000 people. So when and where is their question going to have application to my life? When they say to Jesus, hey, where would we get enough food to feed this many people? I will never, ever, ever, ever experience a circumstance like that. To that I say, hold up just a moment. Because though you may never ask that specific question, in form, many of you have already asked the question, and if you haven't, you're going to. You say, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? When they are asking Jesus the specific question about the food, though you may not be asking that specific question or experience that exact dilemma, in form you either have or will continue to experience something very similar. And here it is. They are coming to Jesus with their impossible circumstance. And they're saying, what do we do with this? Now, you might not have had, and you will not almost certainly feed ever 4,000 people at any one time. However, in all likelihood, you have, and if you haven't, you certainly will experience a circumstance of some sort that you put into the impossible category. Where you say, you know what, this requires $1. That's 4 quarters, and all I have is a dime, a nickel, and a broken button. This is my impossible circumstance. It could be because of something that's going on in terms of your family. It could be in terms of what's going on financially. It could be something that's going on with your health. But you have, or you will at some point, experience a circumstance where you say, listen, there is no way out of this. It is absolutely impossible for me to do X. It's impossible for me to climb that mountain. It's impossible for me to cross that chasm. So, what do I do? And you look toward heaven and you say, what do I do with this? That's essentially what the disciples are saying to Jesus. We have before us an impossible circumstance. So, Jesus, what do we do? I don't know about you. I'm glad they were wondering that, because how Jesus responds was not only instructive for them, it's also instructive for us. So what do we do with this? Well, Jesus doesn't give a specific answer to their question, does he? In fact, Jesus responds with a question. He asks them, what do you have with you? And they respond with the 7 loaves of bread that they had. Jesus' response to them communicates some lessons and some principles that are important for you and me to understand, because your impossible circumstance, your next impossible circumstance, is at some point on the horizon. So what do you need to know? Based on Jesus' response, you need to know this. Jesus is not indifferent to your plight. Jesus is not indifferent to your plight. This is very, very easy to see in this passage, because it is said and expressed directly. Notice what we're told. Verse 1 says there was this large crowd. They had nothing to eat. So Mark, the narrator, is describing the difficulty for us. And how does Jesus respond? What does he say? In verse 2 it says, I have compassion on the crowd. It is not simply that they experienced a need, but they experienced a need, and you need to understand 2 things. Jesus identified the need, and notice this, he identified the need without somebody coming to him saying, Psst, Jesus, by the way, they don't have anything to eat. Jesus identifies and understands the need in the absence of someone saying it to him. And secondly, we're told, not only does he identify the need, but he is affected by the need. Some of you may be facing what you deem to be an impossible circumstance right now. For some of you, you have some of those in the rearview mirror, but at the very least, we all have some. If we live long enough, we have some more that we're racing towards. As you experience that circumstance that you deem to be, or will experience to be, and characterize as impossible, understand this. Jesus will know what it is that you need, what it is that you are facing, and secondly, know this. He is not indifferent to it. He is affected by what is affecting you. Oh, what does it mean to say, though, fully that Jesus is not indifferent to? What does it mean to be indifferent? Sometimes we can understand what something means, not simply by giving or having received an explicit definition, but by thinking about what it doesn't look like. Let me show to you what indifference does not look like. A few weeks ago, I was at Walmart and I saw something on the cereal aisle I had not seen before. Post makes this cereal, and it's called Honey Maid S'mores. You may be familiar with Honey Maid. They're the people who make graham crackers. And so I guess the 2 companies, or maybe Post owns them both, I don't know, but they've merged together, and so you have this s'mores cereal that's got these little graham cracker pieces, these little chocolate cereal pieces, and what seems to be 1 million little marshmallows in this cereal. I'm not lying. This is the reason God made bowls. It is the best cereal I think I have ever had. I had never heard of it before, never been exposed to it. It is now my favorite cereal. It is a hit with everybody in our house, from Peter all the way to me. We all love this cereal. And I don't even know how many boxes we have been through over the past few weeks. The other night I had gone to Walmart and I came home with 3 boxes. And Caroline said, "Why did you buy these 3 boxes? I need you to stop buying this cereal." In fact, she says this, and I was aghast. She said, "I think I'm going to give it away." What? What? Why would you do something like that? And she said this, I can't know that stuff is in the house and not eat it. I'm telling you, it's that good. You don't even need, if you don't like milk, you're lactose intolerant, it's just as good dry. It is delicious. But she said, I can't know that it's here and not eat it. That's the opposite of indifference. Indifference is to know something and not be affected by it. You need to understand that as you have experienced your impossible circumstance, the Lord is absolutely aware of what you are going through, and it matters to Him. He is not indifferent to it. It has an effect on Him. It is not as if simply He is looking from His vantage point in heaven and saying, Jesus sees their need. He's aware of what they're going through in the absence of someone explaining it to Him, and He is affected by it. I hope that comes as encouraging news that for you, if you're part of God's family, if you have a personal relationship with the Lord, and in fact, there's a group that has a song that says this, if it matters to you, it matters to the Master. He's not indifferent to your plight. But there's another thing that you need to understand before you face your next impossible or as you're experiencing your impossible circumstance. And that is that Jesus' primary aims for you are spiritual. Jesus' primary aims for you are spiritual. How long has it been since the people have had something, at least of substance, to eat? 3 days. How long are we okay without something to eat? About 30 minutes. It's been 3 days. And I'm still amazed by this, but you have, whether it's in church, maybe it's at school, maybe it's at work, but you have had your ability to listen to something affected by your feelings of hunger, right? I mean, you get to a point, there's hungry, and then you may be familiar with hangry, right? You get mad about it. And your hunger and your stomach churning, it affects your ability to listen. But my goodness, these people have been listening to Jesus. They've been hanging on every word now, 3 days now. 3 days they have been listening. And so they have been experiencing this need. They didn't have anything of substance on day one. And so Jesus, when does He respond to their need? Is it that He shows up with supper on the first day or breakfast on the second? How about lunch on the third? Now, Jesus responds to their need after 3 days. But and notice this, what has He been doing for 3 days? He's been teaching them. He's been pouring into them over and over and over again, imparting spiritual truth to them for these days now. Now, we read this a moment ago, but when the disciples asked the question, hey, where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? Jesus asked the question, how many loaves do you have? And so you know what's getting ready to happen. Jesus gets these loaves of bread. They happen to, we got some fish too. Jesus blesses this, and He multiplies miraculously this food in such a way that not only do 4,000 people have enough to eat, but there is more left over than there was when they started. Multiplied times more left over than when they started. But notice how the passage ends. Jesus feeds them. Verse 9 says this, about 4,000 were there. Again, that could just be men. It could be total people, or it could, if it's just men, then that means that we're talking 12, 15, 16,000 people. Anyway, a lot of folks. But notice how verse 9 ends. He dismissed them. And what happens then? Jesus immediately goes and gets in a boat and heads somewhere else. Does Jesus say this? Guys, now that you've got something to eat, let's let this thing continue. I was thinking about sharing with you part 2. Jesus has poured into them spiritually. He meets the physical need, and then He's done. He moves on somewhere else. I don't know if you see this, but ask yourself this question. Between meeting the physical need and meeting the spiritual need of truth and the need for truth that people have, which of those seems to matter most to Jesus? Seems pretty clear. Meeting the spiritual need. Now, again, that doesn't suggest, and hear me in this, it doesn't suggest that Jesus was indifferent to the physical need. Clearly, he meets this. But what was the focus on? What did he spend most of his time doing? It was spiritual investment. What does this say to me? What does this say to you? As you experience your impossible circumstance, know that God knows what you're going through. He's not indifferent to it. But as you're experiencing this, His goals as you go through this ultimately are spiritual. What does this look like? I don't know if you saw this on the news or not, but in England, KFC had a problem. They had changed distributors and the supplier for their chicken. And I don't know what the exact details were, whether that supplier was incapable of fulfilling the orders or there was some hitch in the supply chain. But regardless, this supplier could not deliver to all these hundreds of restaurants the chicken that they needed. And so literally hundreds of KFCs in England for a period of more than a week closed their doors. You say, well, why did they close their doors? They had mashed potatoes. They had gravy. They had green beans. They had corn. They had those biscuits, right? Those really, really good KFC biscuits. Forgive me for continuing to talk about food. I don't know why that's the theme today, but all of that stuff was there. They still had tea and coffee and soft drinks. They had all of that. Why did they then close their restaurants? You say, well, duh. It's KFC. The C is for chicken. It's Kentucky Fried Chicken. And if you don't have chicken, sure, all the other things that's well and good. Those other things are nice. I want them as part of what it is that I'm having. But if there is no chicken, I'm not going there. If we don't have chicken, there's no use in being open. That doesn't suggest that the other things are unimportant. It just suggests that they are not of greatest importance. Understand this, as you face your impossible circumstance, I'm not suggesting that the money doesn't matter. I'm not suggesting that the grief doesn't matter. I'm not suggesting that none of these things are or that God is indifferent to. But what I am saying to you is this, and I believe this passage bears this out, that God's greatest aims for you as you go through your impossible circumstance are spiritual. Paul put it this way in Romans 8, verse 29, that God, this is God's expectation and this is His plan for those that are in relationship with Him. If you've got a personal connection with God, if you're part of His family, this is what God through Paul says about you. That He predestined, so He planned beforehand to conform you, to conform me to the image of His Son. That God's plan is to make me increasingly like Jesus. And that whatever it is that He permits or leads me to experience in life, it has the ultimate aim and the ultimate goal of accomplishing that. It reminds me that His ultimate aims and purposes for me, for you, for all of us, they're spiritual. With that in mind, what do you do with that? Well, candidly, I think it first of all leads you to think about, for example, thus far, what are some of your impossible circumstances? Stuff that you've gone through that you put in that category. Some of you, without even thinking, would say, it was a time or a season of unparalleled loss. Maybe it's because you lost a spouse. Maybe it's because you lost a child and watched a small casket get lowered into the ground. And as that is happening and your heart is breaking, you think, how in the world can I even go on. Maybe your impossible circumstance is that it was your company gets bought out. In the process of trying to trim costs, they decide you're a cost that they can trim. You've been a good employee. You've been with them for years, but all of a sudden you find out your job is gone. And so what do you do? In fact, in particular, what do you do when you've been trying as best you can and you have literally been busting it to find something, anything, but then there's a notice that comes in the mail from the bank that says foreclosure proceedings have begun, and that's your impossible circumstance. Maybe it's a teenager at school and you've gotten some peer pressure to do some stuff, to participate in some things that you know are out of bounds. And though there's a lot of pressure to do this stuff that's out of bounds, you realize if I cross that line, there's going to be potentially real and painful costs. However, if I don't go along to get along, I may find myself very lonely, isolated. It feels like a catch-22. It's a lose-lose proposition. It feels very impossible. As you experience your impossible circumstances, understanding and reminding yourself that God's primary aims for you are spiritual should lead you to ask this question. What is it that He's trying to teach me? What is it that I can see in this circumstance like none other that helps accomplish the process of me becoming more like Jesus? Now hear me in this. I understand that's not an easy thing to say. If you have been through some of these painful losses like I have just described, I'm not suggesting that it's easy to say, okay, let me wipe my tears and say, what can I learn? But I'm just telling you. Yeah, God's not indifferent to the specifics of your circumstance, to the physical aspects of your circumstance. But I'm telling you, as you go through that, He has something going on. He's got a plan that's unfolding that has the aim and the purpose of making you more and more like Jesus. So ask yourself, even if it's asking and trying to observe through real tears, what is it that He's trying to help me to see that by understanding it makes me more like Him? As you face your impossible circumstance, understand He's not indifferent to your plight, that Jesus' aims for you are primarily spiritual, and finally this, the impossible is still possible to ask. The impossible is still possible to ask. I think it's interesting how this passage unfolds, though, that Jesus has identified the problem, that they've got thousands of people, they've been hanging out with Jesus for 3 days, nothing of consequence to give them. And Jesus, after communicating the need, and He says to His disciples, hey, I've got compassion on the crowd because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. He further says, I can't even send these people home because a stack of them will just pass out. They'll collapse from physical exhaustion on the way home because of lack of nutrition. And the disciples respond with their question in verse 4. Where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? If you had to characterize their question, what category would you put it in? I'd put it in this one, rhetorical. I mean, do you really think that they were thinking that Jesus is going to say, oh, go to this place, there's enough for 4,000 people? Now, wherever they are, again, the disciples describe it as desolate. They're not even in town. But think, if you are in town in the first century, where can you go where they've got enough, where you can get enough food for 4,000 people in one fell swoop? I mean, even if they were in Jerusalem, it would have been difficult to find at any one or a few places enough to feed that many people. You know, of course, there's no Sam's, there's no Costco, there's no place to buy this in bulk. But even in the day, there was nothing to be able to supply or to meet this need. And so when they say to Jesus, where could we find enough food in this desolate place? I believe that to be rhetorical because I believe this was their anticipated answer. And they wanted Jesus to say this. You know, you're right, I should have let them go earlier. I really think that is the foundation of their question. They're wanting Jesus to say, hey guys, this one's on me. But Jesus doesn't do that. What does he do? He says, guys, how much bread do you got? We got 7 loaves. Well, how about giving that to me? And so what he does is ask for what they have. They tell him, and how much of that does Jesus take? He takes all of it. He takes all of it. You remember the old song, "Little is much when God is in it"? Bear this in mind, that a God who can make everything out of nothing can absolutely do something with your little bit. And so he asked them, hey guys, what do you have? They said, we've got this bread. And then, oh, by the way, we found a few fish too. And so Jesus blesses it, prays over it. They start dispersing food to people, and it just doesn't run out over and over and over and over. This person, this family, this group, all these people get fed. In fact, the text says that they were fed to the point that they were satisfied. So it wasn't like Jesus passed out a communion wafer where everybody got something. I mean, this is filet o fish, right? It's bread and fish. And they get enough to the point where they are satisfied. In fact, there's so much that there's these basketfuls left over. They asked the question of Jesus, but I really believe their question was rhetorical. When they said, where are we going to get something? I believe the expectation was for Jesus to say, yeah, I messed that one up. I'll do better next time. What it seems that they failed to understand was this, that it's still possible to ask of God the impossible. Now hear me in this. I'm not suggesting that when you say, hey God, I need X, that all of a sudden you get X plus Y, and that it's essentially God just gets his checkbook out and signs it, and you pay to the order of and the amount, and that all of that's going to happen just as you would like. I am saying this, though. There's a lot of circumstances that we can or will encounter where a lot of times we don't even bother to talk to God about it because we say this, there's just nothing that can be done. There's just nothing that can be done. When they said, well, where could we find food for these many people? I think the thought is, hey, Jesus, there's nothing that can be done. We just need to be reminded of this reality, that there is a God in heaven, and if you know him and you're part of his family, you have a relationship with someone that thrives on and loves to work in the impossible. Because when he works in the impossible, the only way to explain what occurred is that he did it. They asked Jesus the question, hey, where are you going to find food for all this? Again, you probably have not, and you will not ask specifically that question, but in form, you either have or will. What am I supposed to do with my impossible circumstance? And he wants you to know he's not indifferent to what you're going through. That as you're facing that, he's got spiritual aims that are not indifferent to everything else that you're facing, but it's the most important thing. And that even though you believe it to be an impossible circumstance, do not forget to talk to him about it. Because even in the impossible, it's still possible for a God who can make everything out of nothing. Will you bow your heads with me? When I talk about impossible circumstances today, some of you would say, I have been recently, or I am going through one of those. And maybe there's people around you that don't know the details, but you know it. Certainly God knows it. Maybe it is that what you've been going through has led you to feel pretty angry at God. And maybe he's responding to you to say through his word, hey, what you're going through matters to me. Can I just say that again even more clearly? What is on your heart right now matters to the one who made you. Let me remind you of this again. He loves you enough to lay his life down for you. Why in the world would he be indifferent to what you're facing? He's not. And as you're going through that, there's stuff that He's wanting you to see. I can't tell you what that is, but He, through His Word and through His Spirit, wants to show you. Maybe you need to say to Him today, maybe you want to come and kneel at this altar and say, Lord, I needed to hear that. I needed to hear that you know what's going on, that it matters to you. But God, I really need you to help me see what's going on. I mean, to see what, there's lessons that if you want me to learn something in this, it's so lousy, please let there be something good that comes from this because I want to learn it. Please use this to make me more like you. Or maybe it is that you would say, Michael, when you talked about foregoing, even talking to God about it because it seems so impossible, that's me. That's what I've been going through. And I've talked to my friends about it, talked to my family about it, I've talked to everybody that would listen to about it except for God. Because I've thought, what's the use? What can happen? Maybe you need to give your impossible circumstance to a God with whom, and of whom it is said, with Him all things are possible. Something that's possible for every one of you here today is this. You can leave this place having a relationship with the one who made you. If you don't get anything else, understand this. We want you to experience what we and so many others have. In a moment, you're going to have a time where you can leave where you are and come share that with me. We can begin a conversation, or I can talk to you afterwards. We want you to experience it. It'll change your life. It'll change what you experience when this life is over. Maybe this is your day that God's leading you to become a part of the Gate City family. Maybe there's some burden you just want to talk to God about. I believe that He's spoken because He wants us to respond. And with all that being said, let me just say, Lord, as you have put burdens on our hearts, as you are guiding, as you are prompting, as you are inviting, I pray, God, that we hear it, that we recognize it's from you, and that we respond. We respond however you are calling us to do it. We say this to you in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to ask if you would to stand as our praise team leads us in the hymn of invitation. As He's spoken to you, you respond today.
Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in